All right. So, what are we talking about
Today?
Yeah.
I think we're going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room in our whole industry right now: compensation.
Yeah. How you? I'm gonna let you lead this conversation. I don't want to get you in trouble by my questions because all my questions are probably legal.
I'll let you ask your questions. I just might not answer them.
That's right.
Just kidding. I'll do my best.
Yeah. All right. So, what do you want to talk about as far as the conversation goes? Obviously, it's been talked about ad nauseum. Surprisingly, still not a lot of people understand it, but the lawsuit that happened, was it last year? Well, now we're settled last year.
Yeah, it was settled.
Been going for a couple of years, but so yeah, you want to start there?
Yeah. I think a common misconception that I run into is that people think that this is something that happened very, very recently, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
This has kind of been on the radar of the Department of Justice, of the DOJ, for quite some time. And ultimately, the reality is what the DOJ wanted to see was compensation completely separated. So they didn't want what was considered co-brokerage compensation. So they didn't want, one broker saying this is my fee. If there's a co-broker, then we'll pay them this amount. They wanted... Ultimately, what they would love to see, it seems, is buyers pay for their agents, sellers pay for their agents.
Right.
The problem that we're seeing with that is that's putting a lot of cost on the buyers when they're already struggling to come up with enough money for a transaction to happen. In a lot of cases, not in all cases, but you think of your first-time home buyers or the VA. So if you're using a VA product, you cannot pay your agent directly. The VA has come out and they're trying to work with that and trying to come up with some things to make that happen. But, you're asking buyers to bring not only their down payment, their closing costs. A lot of times they have to pay for their inspection. They may have to pay for some repairs. They may be doing an appraisal waiver or waiving some of that deficit should there be one, their moving costs. So it adds up really quickly. And then when you're throwing agent compensation on top of that, we're seeing some buyers getting priced out of the market completely when you try to do that. So I think it's been interesting to watch it all play out from my perspective. I think a lot of agents were really panicking about it in the beginning.
Sure.
And I don't know that there was a reason for that aside from people don't like change.
They don't like change, and everybody was getting their information from headlines, not reading the meat of articles or the situation.
Or the lawsuit. That's what I found a lot is people weren't even reading.
No, it was
what
just
was
the
actually
clickbait
happening.
headlines.
100%.
And of course, a lot of those headlines is just to get you to click on it, and then the story has nothing to do with the actual headline.
For sure.
So, yeah, how it all came about, and I've talked about it before, was fascinating for me to watch being on the other side of it because like I said for a while, hey, what are you going to do? Like I asked this question during the marketing class that I do, like, hey, what happens if, how are you going to pivot and shift if this goes through? Yep. And I kept getting told by agents, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. Yeah, I'm not worried about that. I was like, okay, but what if?
Right.
What's your plan B? What's your plan C? If you have to pivot your business because all of this changes your business, if it happens. And it was just shocking the amount of, that's years away. We don't have to worry about that. It's years away. Or it's going to get dismissed or whatever, or it's frivolous. And it may have been, like, I don't know. And then it happened. And then there was all this panic. And that's what was fascinating to me is that there was a significant change potentially happening in your industry. And so many people just chose to ignore it versus setting up contingency plans. And that's business 101. Like there's a reason why Sears didn't make it, right? Or Kmart or somebody like that. Because it's always, this is how we've always done it. This is how we're always going to do it. And we don't care what the world is changing to. Versus you see like restaurants, for example, every so often either change their menu or change their drinks or change their theme or whatever, because they're changing with who they see walking through their door, right? Because you have to be able to adapt. So that was always fascinating to me, was just like I said, the ignoring of, or pretending like it wasn't happening.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of what we said in the past, that I think a lot of people get into real estate not understanding that congratulations, you just became a business or a small company. And so if you're not having that mentality, and if you haven't prepared yourself for that or trained yourself for the fact that this is what happened, now you are a small business and you need to plan for that, then you're going to run into issues and you may crash and burn. And I think, from studying companies the way that I have over the past few years, you're exactly right. The ones that succeed really well and do really well are the ones that can innovate, or the ones that can tweak it just a little bit and put something out and market really well to doing things a little bit different. I think of Apple. They've done this so many times, right? And even there's some stuff that they'll put out that maybe doesn't take off all the way, or they'll change the iPhone ever so slightly and relaunch it, right?
That's right.
But, if you're not willing to keep doing that and to keep trying new things, then you're going to stall out. And I think it was a lot of wishful thinking for a lot of agents of, this scares me and I don't know enough, so we're going to pretend like it's not happening.
For sure. And then when you get to who gets paid and how they get paid, from my understanding, because, obviously I get paid differently. I get paid when I do the job at the time of service. But it was always in the agreement, right? How the buyer's agent was going to get paid.
In a buyer brokerage agreement.
Yeah. So
at least for us, I'm going to speak for my market.
Sure. So the fact that all of a sudden the world is, the sky is falling.
Which is funny because it's still in your buyer brokerage agreement.
Yeah. So if you want to get paid X percent, it just goes in that agreement. It's always
whatever
like
your
that.
fee is.
Yeah.
I mean, you could charge
and
a
if the
flat fee, you
seller
could charge
or-
an hourly,
yeah.
you can
And
charge
if that
whatever you
didn't
want.
get covered by the seller, or however you want to phrase that, then you still had to come up with that information. I think it's just years and years and years of it never having to be done that way. Even though, and no one ever explained it, because it was always just assumed and a given that, oh, well, you don't have to worry about this. I'll work for free, right?
That was where a lot of agents, and they still are doing it, and they need to be really, really careful. You cannot say that you were working for free.
Yeah.
Because you're not.
You're not. You're you're not a charity. You're not working for free.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can't.
Or
can't
free
give
for
a
the buyer, right?
Like the service that we do, you can't give it for free. Like if you want to assign even a dollar value to your fee, okay. But yeah, that was one of the things that people were really screwing up on. And I think the thing that's kind of a bummer is ultimately a lot of it comes back to a lack of training within our industry. And so I think you had a lot of agents, especially through the height of the market, while all of this was going on in the background, you had new agents who are flooding the market, who are trying so hard just to figure out how this works in a market that hasn't really previously existed. It was just pure chaos. And there were so many things that were not normal about that time. And so, these new agents are trying to navigate that, or more experienced agents were trying to navigate those changes. And there wasn't enough focus and emphasis and training in some brokerages that I've seen to explain to their agents, this is how you need to be doing things. This is how we do it by the book. This is how we're staying in line with what's going on. And so, it's hard from an agent standpoint, because there were agents that were flailing and that were making mistakes and were doing things really wrong. But it's like, okay, does that fall back on your leadership team, or is it on you, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, and the structure of real estate in general is always that it's bizarre to me to begin with, because you're a 1099, but you belong to one brokerage, right? I had someone when I first started, they asked me if I wanted to be a 1099 for another home inspection company. They're like, hey, I'm just getting too busy, whatever, I have some overflow. Do you mind doing this? I said, sure. I was just getting started. And then when I met with him, and at the time, the business partner, they try to slide a non-compete to me. I'm like, that's not how this works.
Right.
Right. Like, I'm a 1099. Like, you can't non-compete me.
Mm-hmm.
I have a right to work for whoever I want. That's how this works as a 1099 contractor. You know, a 1099 contracted electrician, they can work for 15 different companies. You know, just whoever's going to give them the job that day.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't non-compete someone who's a 1099. But in real estate, it's very much, you don't get a non-compete, but it's you're locked in now. You just can't work under any brokerage.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the brokerage really can't force you, to show up for their office meetings and things like that. I mean, they can have standards and cut you loose, but like I say, it's just bizarre how all that is set up and how it's allowed to exist in its current state. So going back to seeing in these groups even today, how many people are asking the same questions they've been asking for almost a year now, if not longer, because before the settlement actually took place, these questions were popping up, is shocking, just to say the least, because I know in our area, and there's been some hiccups, but the associations do their town halls.
Right.
Now 7,000 agents and 400 in a pop because there's limitations on audiences. So, I mean, good luck.
Yeah. And they run like 2. And so it's like, okay, you have over 7,000 licensed agents in our market, and you're capped on a Zoom meeting to 400 per. Yeah. That means you're fitting in less than 1,000 of your 7,000 plus agents. Yeah. So, I think to your point, I think real estate in this industry is about to face a really big overhaul. And I honestly think it's a good thing. I think that our industry, there are a lot of nuances to it that don't make sense. And I think there's a lot of things that do need to shift and adjust. And I think also the public perception of our industry is very, very negative. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that maybe our industry doesn't deserve that reputation a little bit. So I'm very curious to see moving forward what changes are to come. And I am curious to still see what agents are going to dig their heels in and pretend like it's not happening, and which ones are going to innovate and train to a very high degree to prepare themselves and their business for what is to come. And I'm actually really excited to see where we end up, because I think there's a lot of room for improvement here. Yeah,
for sure. And the interesting thing is I've seen agents who, even though this was coming, they don't like having those conversations with their buyers, right? Like, hey, I can't work for free. This is how it's traditionally been. But because there's no guarantee that the seller is going to cover my commission.
Sure.
So I know a few agents who's just not having that conversation with the buyers. And if the seller offers 2% less than what they're asking for, they just eat it. They're not going back to their buyers and saying, hey, I'm a little light on what.
And that's crazy to me, because the changes that we've seen to our forms, it spells out that the only option you have is the buyer will pay this. You can ask and try to negotiate, but ultimately they've signed a document saying they will pay this amount. Mm-hmm. So I think agents need to be really careful with that as well. And I think, to your point, we're seeing a lot of agents who are shying away from these conversations because of a lack of training. Yeah. They don't know how to explain it properly. They don't know what the changes are. And they also don't know. I had this conversation with a rookie agent. They don't know how to speak towards their value as an agent. Right. And I've seen this even with experienced agents. They don't have any sort of value proposition. Right. What you can't do is go to a client and be like, I'm going to work really hard and I have access to MLS. That's kind of everyone.
That's everyone, yeah.
So
that's where we start.
You better have a whole lot of other things to help you explain your value, what it is that you do, how you're going to protect them. Mm-hmm. It's why my biggest pet peeve is when people are like, oh, you work in real estate, you work in sales. No, the hell I do not. Yeah. I am not a salesperson. My job is to protect you. I am not here to sell you something. I'm here to hold your hand, to make sure that you're safe in one of the largest financial purchases of your entire life.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of, especially on the buy side, it's not sales, it's negotiating and consulting is what you're doing.
100%.
Sell side, the only thing that changes is you have a product you sell. but everything else is the same.
And to me, that is marketing instead.
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
for sure. And I think a lot of it is just they complicated the money. I think, and some people agree, some don't, but it always goes back to follow the money, right? The seller's paying. Okay, but really the buyer gets the loan.
Right. That's the thing that I want people to remember.
Yeah, the buyer's the one that's getting a 30-year loan and paying on all that. So they're paying the interest, they're doing the monthly payments on the loan that's going to the seller. Then the seller takes the money out of that lump sum and then distributes it, whatever, But I think that maybe that's an oversimplification of it. But I also think that it's just been overly complicated on where the funds go, because I've seen some fights break out on old Twitter face over that simple concept. Like, well, you wouldn't have any money if the buyer didn't get the loan. Well, that's the seller's proceeds, and okay, it's the same pot of money. You're just changing hands, and then how it gets distributed. I think, and I'm sure I've been told anyways, I don't care that much to look into it, but I've been told that, just the way it gets distributed is locked in on laws and regulations. But at some point, they're probably going to have to change how the money gets dispersed. Because if you take $10,000 off the top from the settlement company and just go straight to the buyer's agent, and then the seller gets $490, $10,000 less than what they offered, what's the difference? You know what I mean? If the money's still coming out.
Yeah. And that's, our forms have already, and I will say for our market and our local association, I think they've done a decent job of trying to get our forms to be in line with the changes that are coming and the changes that have already occurred. So when you're looking at our purchase agreement, our listing agreement, and our buyer brokerage agreement, they are in line with who is paying what. So that way it's pretty clear. And it also has completely eliminated this option of a co-broker compensation. So it really is spelling out, okay, this is who's doing this. This is who's doing this. And it isn't no longer a situation where you're seeing a brokerage take a lump sum or fee or whatever and distribute it to another brokerage. It is completely separate now.
Right. So what's your thoughts on moving forward on how all this continues to play out? Because, I don't know, when did this take effect?
So it was settled July of last year, and then everything, I want to say, went into effect fully September or October. I'm not sure exactly. I think it was September. And it's been really interesting to watch it kind of shake out. I would say for the first 2 weeks, it was a little chaotic. But I think we've kind of leveled out into somewhat of a new normal. I do think we're going to continue to see adjustments to that for quite some time.
How much?
How many adjustments do I think are to come? It's kind of a crystal ball question, but if I had to guess, I think we're going to see quite a bit more, because what happened was, you had the Sitzer-Burnett lawsuit, which kind of got the ball rolling onto this, but now you're seeing all these offshoots of separate lawsuits. So now you have the buyers suing for exactly what the sellers were suing for. Yes. And then, even Sitzer-Burnett, it was this group of sellers who came together because they thought it was just so not fair. But then the attorney who won this lawsuit turned around and opened his own brokerage, offering a flat fee company. Yeah. So it's it's all too
we had a lot of money to do that.
Yeah. So, I think you're going to continue to see this be an issue in our industry for quite some time. And I do think ultimately the DOJ wants what they want. I think they want buyers pay for their agents, sellers pay for their agents. I think you're also going to see a lot of changes to structures. And we've always had that, right? There's flat fee brokerages, there's pay for service. You could do a small fee just to list it on MLS. Yep. I'll do nothing else for you. We've had independent contractors. Yeah. I think you're going to see more and more of that.
Concierge service.
Yeah. I think that we will see a lot more structures to how agents get paid. I think you're going to see a lot of agents adjusting what they want their fees to be, whether they're going to a flat fee, whether they're going to I think what we could see is retainer agreements soon, similar to commercial real estate. I have had a pretty big desire to study commercial real estate because I could see us going in that direction, and doing things kind of in line with how commercial functions. I also think you may see hourly rates soon, which I'm a big fan of personally. It's been interesting to have those conversations with agents and also with public where they're like, well, why don't you just charge an hourly? And I'm like, I promise you don't want me to charge an hourly, but I will if you want me to. But it's probably not going to end well for the end consumer. So I do think we're going to see quite a few changes. I think they're going to be all over the map of what's to come.
Yeah. The hourly thing I think is fascinating because you're right. It's not good for the end consumer because you look at why people, like we've talked about before, the issue of when something goes wrong, why doesn't anybody do anything about it as far as the consumer goes in real estate? And the answer is always because of lawsuits are expensive and long, right? Because lawyers charge per the minute. Right, like if they've got,
you send them an email and you're getting a bill.
Getting charged, So they literally charge for everything. I don't blame them, right? I mean, time is time, right? So and when I had to use a lawyer for a personal reason, #divorce, not my current wife, but the first one. We had that conversation like, hey, I can mail this letter. Or you can mail this letter. If I mail a letter, I'm going to charge you, for the stamp, for the envelope, for the paper, for the time typing it, for the time going to the mailbox, all the things. And I was like, whatever. But that's what they do. Yep. So great for them, but it really sucks when you're in a really bad position and you need that service, but you don't have the money to do all that. And, to build on that, one of the things, and it's a distraction thing, and everybody does it in every industry with every situation, but you go in some of these groups where they were talking about the lawsuit, all anybody was talking about was, well, it's not fair that the attorney charged 33%. Okay. You're not wrong, but what does that got to do with you? It changes nothing. Yes, the attorneys got rich. That's how this works. All right. Your industry is still changing. Like, be mad at the attorneys all you want. They did their job, right? If you want to get a class action against attorneys and how they charge 33% on class action, go for it. Yeah. But you're distracted by the shiny object over here and not really focusing on what's happening. Like, and I'll always go with the thought process of worry about what you can change. You can't change that.
Right.
That, like, what's done is done. Now you got to figure it out and move on. But so many people, they don't. They want to focus on, well, that's not fair. They get to charge that. Okay, we'll go be a lawyer.
Right.
I mean, like no one says you have to be a realtor. Go be a lawyer if you want to charge that. Because it's clearly okay that they do that, but they don't want to hear that.
Well, and I think that kind of goes in line with the point of, there was a lot of clickbait headlines that were like, commissions are abolished or whatever, right?
Yes,
and I was like, well, hold on, back up. I've seen a lot of people try to argue that, right? Or trying to be like, well, fees are negotiable. It's like, okay, fees are negotiable, but I get to set what I work for.
Yeah.
Like, can I negotiate it? Sure. Do I have to? No. Like, my background is hair. Like, if I charge $35 for a haircut and you come in and you're like, well, they'll do it for $17. It's like, all right, go get a $17 haircut if that's like what you want to do. Yeah. And they're like, well, no, I want you to do it for $17. It's like, no, my fee is this. And so I think folks need to remember that as well. And you set your fees and you get to negotiate what you're willing to do and what that looks like and what your service will look like. But I think agents need to be really, really careful with that as well. Because from my perspective, as much as people like to be really loud about like, well, this isn't about fair housing violations or anything. Right. Like, well, okay. But even if I don't mean to, what if I establish a pattern of like, okay, well, people in this price bracket get like this fee.
Right.
And then these guys get this fee.
Yeah.
And like, maybe if you look like this, like you have to be really, really careful.
You do. That conversation comes up in the home inspector groups on pricing. You get asked, do you charge more because the house is more expensive?
Mm-hmm.
You know, which, I mean, if that's what you want to do, cool. But,
Right.
You know, we don't. It's just how big's the house,
Mm-hmm.
right? How old's the house? If we charge more because the house costs more, it has nothing to do because the client has more money. It has to do because the client's being a pain, and it's going to be worth us to, because that usually happens as well, right?
Yeah.
Like the more money, more of a pain that the client could be, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, we charge
For the
based
time that it's
off
going
the
to
time.
take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that conversation does happen. You know, some people do that. They pull up the listing and they say, oh, it's a 1.3 million. I'm going to triple my fee. You can. You know, it's not going to be good for business in the long run.
Right.
But you can. And same thing, I mean, you guys are, or not probably, you are governed a lot
We are.
heavily, more
Mm-hmm.
heavily than what we are. We're not governed at all when it comes to that. It's just the Wild West.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the reality is, if we're being super honest, then we should really be charging more for the lower incomes, because those houses are typically a lot more wrong with them,
Maybe.
a lot more time.
Yeah.
You know, versus the $800,000-900,000 or $1 million homes.
See, I would argue though, like if there's problems in those more expensive homes, there's bigger problems usually. There's more systems to
Sure.
check,
Sure.
right? There's more square footage. There's larger roofs. Like you're looking at potentially spending more time per system than if
More
you're
time
looking
you
at like
are.
1,000
Yeah,
square
but as
foot
far as the
house.
actual write-ups go,
Yeah.
you know, it's usually the $150,000 home.
Yeah.
So, because it just hasn't been maintained.
Yeah.
Unless they're house poor, right? Because we see that in some of these
Yeah.
neighborhoods where they bought a $800,000 home,
And couldn't keep up with it.
but they're house poor, right?
Yeah.
And they couldn't keep up with it, and then in 5 years, it's
Sure.
not fun to inspect. Well, fun for social media, but
Yeah,
not,
right.
not for anybody else involved. But I think you're right, and I said that before with the different styles and methods on how people are going to figure out how to get compensated. I was told at one point that it's against NAR's code of ethics to do a concierge service. You know, I'm going to charge $500 to open doors. I'm going to charge $1,000 to write the contract or whatever. But I also know that that's only in effect as long as they don't have to worry about money, because ethics and code of ethics change depending on how much money you need. Right?
Well,
And that's everybody. That's not specific to this association. But if they start losing members because the members can't get compensated, and it's against the code of ethics to charge that way, then you'll see that change.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not familiar with that part of the code of ethics, actually.
I never looked it up. That's just what I was
yeah,
told. Because again, I don't care but so much.
But I do agree with you. I think that's the other part of this is that NAR, the National Association of Realtors, they're facing a lot of backlash as well from our industry, from the agents and from the brokers who are sitting here saying like, oh, okay, like, wait a second. Like there was a lack of training. There was a lack of advocating for us. There was very little fight. It seems like it.
No, a lot of transparency.
Yeah. And I think from agent standpoints and brokers, like that's something I don't think that the general public understands is like we pay an astronomical amount in fees for these associations, not only for the national association, but also for our local associations. And I think a lot of us are scratching our heads being like, what am I getting here? Right. And I think that goes in line though, as well with the consumers who are looking at agents or brokers and saying like, okay, your fee is this, but like, what am I getting? And I think as you start to see these structures change and as you start to see maybe more a la carte services or people who are doing a paid by hourly or whatever they choose to do, I think consumers need to be really, really cautious of if you're just hiring whoever is the cheapest or, you know, most cost effective. I can understand that like you need to work within your budget, right? And with what you can afford, and that's great. and it's smart. However, if they can't even negotiate on behalf of themselves, why are you asking them or hiring them to negotiate on behalf of you for your largest asset? Like, that is what makes me really, really nervous. If you have somebody who's just willing to roll over and say, like, all right, I'll do it for whatever they say.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think's going to happen when they have to negotiate for you on your behalf?
Yeah. And the issue always comes down in this industry is the lack of understanding what it's supposed to look like, because you don't do this very often.
Yep.
Right. I mean, there's people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, first time home buyers. Right. Yep. And it may be the only time they ever go through this process. You know, used to be the average, every 5 to 7 years you move, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, and there's people who's gone through it a bunch of times, but you know, I always equate it to, if you go to Chick-fil-A and you get bad service, you know what that looks like because you've been to Chick-fil-A and you've been to 10 different Chick-fil-A's or 50 different Chick-fil-A's. So you know what bad service looks like at Chick-fil-A. Right. But when it comes to this, and this is why reviews are important, for a lot of reasons, but I'll also tell people take reviews with a grain of salt, because 100%. I've seen some really, really bad companies have 5-star reviews because people don't know what they don't know. They don't know what this is supposed to look like. They think they had a great experience and all these other things. But when you really start asking questions like, that person that you use for whatever, whether it's the realtor, the inspector, the title company, the lender, like, they really screwed you over. They don't know. Because they don't have anything to compare it to.
Yeah, and that is that is the thing that I hold out the most hope for in our industry that hopefully will change, is that the standard requirements of training and knowledge and education goes through the roof for us. Because currently right now, you're right, there is over 7,000 agents, and there is a ton of debauchery that goes on behind the scenes, and there is a ton of untrained agents because they don't want to slow down. They don't want to make sure that they know what they're doing. And a lot of them have really good reviews, or they know enough people, so it's friends and family referring them, but their clients have no idea that, like, your agent doesn't know what they're doing. They're putting you in a lot of risk. And so, you know, when you have an industry that is not based on, I mean, what other industry can you be untrained and underqualified and keep your job? Like, how does that happen? How do we have so many agents out here who have no idea what the contract says, how to negotiate it, what they can and cannot do, what your client is or isn't responsible for or liable for or able to legally do, and yet you get to keep your job and you get to say you're a top producer? Like, come on. That's crazy. In what other industry does that happen?
I mean, government. But speaking from experience, the problem is, though, in the current structure of the industry, how do you fix it? Because you have 7,000 agents in this market, right? You go to Nova, you go to Hampton Roads, you go to Southwest Virginia, you know, I mean, Houston, and this is just because of a random podcast I listen to from a company out here. They have like 30,000 plus agents, 35,000 agents, right? Again, independent contractor. So the office can't make you come in and do the training. You can do online training, but we know what realtors do with online training. Same thing I do for online training, and that's turn my camera off and go, you know, fix me a sandwich in the kitchen. If you mandate it, you know, the same thing happens. If you mandate in-person training, which again, good luck, because everybody's a 1099 contractor and there's 7,000 of them. I've been in classes where they half of them's on their phone the whole time, you know, or they step out to take phone calls because they can't shut it off for a couple hours or half a day or
because
a day.
There's no need to prioritize your training or your
education.
Exactly.
So
what happens if there was? What happens if our industry completely shifted to where you actually have to know what you're doing?
Yeah.
What would happen then?
I don't know. So it comes down, and I think the best way, I don't know how it would be implemented, but it would be someone's looking at every deal. It's a QA. right? Someone is responsible, whether that's per brokerage, whether that's at the association level, whether that's at the state level. But every deal that comes through, someone's QA in it to make sure everything is done properly. If the deal falls apart and the house is going back on the market, even more so, because all this, no fault of the seller, when reality is that the foundation's crumbling and it is the fault of the seller because they didn't take care of the home. And this happened, here's your last year, year before, probably a year before. I think we were coming out of COVID. And the rates, it was after the rates went up. The first of the year of that. So I guess that was like last January, right?
Yeah, it would have been rates started rising end of 2022. They were starting to go pretty high.
Yeah, so last January, February, March, that first quarter of last year, I don't know how many inspections I went to where I was told they've already had a home inspection and the seller or the list agent said that there's nothing on it or that they didn't, quote unquote, see it. And then I get into the crawl space and there's $40,000 worth of problems. And so back to the point of, before it goes back on the market, someone is checking all that to make sure that's true, right? Like, oh, did you see the home inspection report? You know, because nothing in here says you saw the home inspection report. Right?
So Colorado does this.
Yeah.
They do this incredibly well.
Yeah.
I have adored looking at how they handle real estate in the state of Colorado because it is completely different than anywhere else. But so Colorado, you have to have a pre-inspection that the seller has to pay for.
Okay.
And it is all of your major systems and it has to pass in order for it to be listed, or you have to disclose we failed this portion of the inspection ahead of time. And it's really interesting to see how smoothly, from my perspective, those transactions go because there is so much disclosure.
Yeah.
For us, we are a caveatum tour, which is a buyer beware state, which is wild. Like, we're telling these little brand new baby home buyers, like, good luck, sweetie. Like, hope you figure it out. Like, and, even when you talk about like our disclosure form, so our residential property disclosure, that's like kind of more of like a disclaimer, if anything. It's not even a disclosure. It's like like, it's not super helpful whatsoever. And so, I think there is a lot of risk involved for our industry when we are operating the way that we are currently operating. And I think, to your point, if we're going to keep agents as 1099 employees, we're going to keep running into a wall because you can't force them to be trained. And I think a lot of it, what I think is going to happen, or what I'd love to see happen, is a lot more liability and responsibility falling on these brokerages to ensure that your agents are actually well trained, that they actually know what they're doing.
I think another approach could be training for the buyers. I do a lot of the Virginia housing classes for first-time home buyers, because if you want a VHDA loan, you have to go through that 8-hour class. And it talks about loans and realtors and deals, and my portion, the home inspection portion, is an hour long, but I get to go in front, and it opens up a lot of eyes. When I just did one this past Saturday, and I told them, one of the slides talks about pest damage being, I said, now be mindful, like, that's pest damage. Like, we're not required by law to report on the actual presence of pest. And the lady was like, what do you mean? And like, if I see a mouse or a rat that's as big as my dog, like, I don't have to tell you, because there's no damage. And she felt some kind of way about that, right?
I bet she did.
But
would like to know if there's a snake living in her attic. Come on.
When she goes to call a home inspector for a home inspection, she's going to ask that question. Like, do you tell me if you see mice and snakes and raccoons and bats and stuff? So I think that a way to do that is, it doesn't matter what loan type. If you're buying a house, you should have to go through some type of class. Yeah. Because now you're putting it on the consumer to ask those questions. Now the consumer is coming to the realtor like, well, wait a minute. No, I can fire you because my contract says I can fire you, right? Or no, this is how this is supposed to work, right? No, I can negotiate this because, my class told me I can negotiate this.
100%.
So again, what does that look like when there's this many buyers, and this many loan types to be able to organize all that? It's a lot. But I also think it would be beneficial because there's so many. One of the things I stress in these classes is understanding what your contract says when it comes to negotiations, because there's so many times I've showed up at a house and they say, well, they have to fix this, right? Well, what does your contract say? And the realtor's like, no, as is. What do you mean as is? You know, maybe they were told they forgot because buyers do buyer things, but maybe they were never told. And they fully didn't understand what it meant.
Well, and how many agents don't understand what these contracts and what these agreements say? And so that is the hardest part too, is like, from my perspective, I'm watching people hire agents thinking like, oh, they've sold so many houses, they know what they're doing. And you're like, no, they don't. And so I think, like, I tell people in my very first meeting with you, like, this is the buyer brokerage agreement. This is what it says. This is how you fire me. These are the reasons that you can fire me. This is how you do it. Should I not perform my job for you? And so I think, like, until we get to this point where agents and brokerages are actually responsible for educating and empowering their clients, you're going to keep running into these issues. And it is scary for consumers. I don't blame consumers for not feeling great about our industry and for wondering like, well, why do I have to pay this fee if you're not doing anything?
Right.
Or, you know, I'm asking questions, or you've put me in a dangerous situation. Like, you should be trusting your agent. You should be fully confident that they know what they're doing, that they know that purchase agreement like the back of their hand.
Sure.
And I think that brokerages really should be putting an emphasis on, do your agents know what they're doing? Are they actually well trained? Are they knowledgeable in their jobs? And if they're not, let them go.
Yeah.
Because what they don't do is let them go, because they're 1099 employees and they're making money. So they're like, well, you know, they're producing agents, and it's like they're also a walking liability. Do you like keeping your doors open? Because there is consequences, at least there should be. And I don't know of another industry quite like ours where you get to just run around talking about how great you are when you don't actually know how to do your job, when you're not trained, when you're not helping.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. I think if you did it, like I said, it's hard to do at the agent level, but I think if you did it at the consumer level, and cause I know if I was an agent and my buyer or seller started asking me all these questions that they learned in their class and I didn't have the answers to, like, well, I guess I need to learn what my job is, right?
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing when your client is telling you how to do your job.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, like I said, I don't have a good answer. I think there's a couple of different ways you can do it, but it takes a strong push from somebody to change the industry. And unfortunately, associations are good for a lot of reasons, but they're also bad for a lot of reasons. And one of the bad things is they try to prevent certain changes from happening, right? Because you go by the loudest voices. And if the loudest voices don't want to change, then the association is going to oppose it.
Well, and
talking about legislation,
we fund them.
Yeah.
So that's where we're running into so many problems within the industry is, you know, the people funding the ones who are creating the rules that are supposed to keep you safe.
Yeah.
How do you not end up with conflicts there? How do you not end up with associations or brokerages backing off of instilling boundaries and rules and consequences to those who are actually funding them to exist?
For sure.
So I think there's a great need in our industry for a lot of shifting and changing. And I'm hopeful that will come in the next, 5 to 10 years, ideally. But I'm not quite sure exactly what that looks like quite yet. Yeah,
it's going to be. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say the further you get away from the lawsuit, the actual, the date of that, it's kind of fading in some people's memories. So they haven't seen a big change. And then I've heard other people say they've seen a lot of changes.
Quite a few changes. And maybe that's because I teach it, right?
Sure.
Like I had to teach every time there was an adjustment to our forms, and there was at least 7 that I can remember last year. So,
and there is something to be said about, like, we know about this stuff because we're surrounded by it. Like, I'm friends with, I don't know.
You're married to an agent.
Yeah. But even on Facebook, you're friends with, hundreds of thousands of agents because that's the business, right? So you know, just like when one agent makes a meme about something, I'll see it 47 times, you know, because that's the newest meme from agents. So, you know, when you're in that world, you see it a lot. But really, the big world, you know, how many people is actually paying attention?
Right.
Because someone said the other day, like, it was something completely different. Like, well, don't you watch the news? And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, no. Like, I was just reading comments, right?
Yeah.
And like, who watches the news anymore? Like, that's the thing.
Why would you watch that?
Yeah, like no, like, and it got me thinking. Like, nobody watches the news. A certain demographic watches the news,
Yes.
but most of us get our news in other forms. And some of those forms, people don't actually do the research. It's just, oh, I saw this title on Facebook. It must be true. Let me share it, and now it's true, and whatnot. So we don't actually consume the news unless we're actually in it, right, for that industry. So I think the further you get away from it, the more it's going to fade, because a lot of people they're still not aware, right? I mean, you get buyers and stuff like, hey, I heard something.
Right. And that's where I think agents, like, you better prepare yourself and your business to understand what's actually happening in your industry and in your career and how to do your job the correct way. Because man, it's got to be embarrassing to get asked those questions and not have a legitimate response, or to not be able to walk somebody through what happened and how that affects them and help them feel empowered to make a decision for their transaction moving forward. Yeah. That is your job.
100%. So what's your advice for anybody when it comes to how to get paid?
My advice for agents is get trained. Make sure that you are confident in the amount of training that you do, that you're doing consistent training, that you have the knowledge and the education and the qualifications behind you. I think my advice for brokerages is start holding your agents accountable. Yeah. As tough as it may be, you got to cut them loose. And I think for the consumer, it's, please, for the love of God, make sure you're hiring somebody who's qualified. Make sure that you have been empowered somewhat to make a smart decision. And if you're running into experiences with agents where they are not doing their job and they are not protecting you, and you don't feel confident in their abilities, that you're cutting them loose. Because that is one of my greatest pet peeves, is the amount of people who tell me as buyers or sellers, they're like, oh my gosh, Mandy, my agent sucks. And I'm like, did you fire him? And they're like, no, I didn't. Like, we closed and it's fine. And I'm like, okay. But like, you hired them and you didn't fire them. So that does fall on you.
It does. It does. And it's fun. Every job, the more you produce or the better you are at the job, the longer leash you get, right? Even if it's just not monetarily, like, there's a direct correlation in your commission and how you get paid. But, you know, when I was in the fire department, you know, it didn't matter. You know, my paycheck was the same. Like, I couldn't get, unless I worked overtime. But the people who got things done, regardless of who they actually were, they had a longer leash, right? So they got away with more. But realtors is a lot like pro athletes. We've all seen those pro athletes. Like, why does that guy keep getting jobs, right? Why do teams keep trading for this? And it's because their talent exceeds, in the minds of the organizations, exceeds the problems that they're creating. And for a lot of brokerages, that's true for some agents, right?
It's for the money.
Like, because they're producers. Like, well, I'll deal with the headaches. You know, I'll deal with you know, the screwed up transactions and deals and all that stuff, because they produce, right? And I can't have any more respect for someone that doesn't care about that. You know, when I see someone like, nah, sorry, you're gone. Like, because these are the standards, and these are the standards whether or not you produce or not. And but time and time again, I've been let down, unfortunately, by people I actually look up to and admire in the industry. And when I see some shadiness going, they just let it go because they're producers. And it's like, you had a chance, you had a moment to back up all the things you say.
Yeah, to have some integrity or some character here. Yeah. And I think that is my point, is the longer the leashes that we allow, or the more that we just look the other way because somebody's bringing in money or they're producing, the more and more problems we're going to have. And unfortunately, I think we're kind of getting to the peak of people and the consumers having a really negative view of our industry because of what we've allowed. And that is a problem. And I think for me personally, like, I want to work in an industry where there is a lot of integrity and there is a lot of character, and we are doing things the right way, and we are trying to protect people. It's why I'm not impressed by your awards. I don't give a shit about that. Like, I don't care.
Yeah.
If you do not know how to protect your clients and you're not doing it to the best of your ability and you're not highly, highly trained and you don't care about that, you don't care about the actual quality of the work that you're doing, I don't have respect for it.
Sure.
So yeah, I think we're at this point of there has to be some shifting moving forward, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. But I think consumers, I don't blame you for being frustrated. And, I'm hopeful that there is some change on the horizon for them.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think there will be.
Yeah.
We get frustrated. I mean, and I know this was more directed towards agents today, but I've made no secret that my industry is just as much of a dumpster fire for various reasons. But on the other side, there's a group of us that talk outside of realtors, but connected to the real estate industry. And we get equally as frustrated. And it's always fun when I have an agent who's like, yeah, I've been in this deal and, list all the problems with this deal. And I just laugh. I'm like, yeah, this is daily for us. That's a Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And because they've never dealt with it before, because they've dealt with good agents. Mm-hmm. It's like, I can't believe this is normal. Like, it's very normal for us. Very normal. Right? Which is unfortunate. But I was like, yeah, this is a Tuesday for us. Welcome to our world. Yeah. With dealing with some of this stuff. But that's a whole nother podcast, or a book, maybe a book, so I could be anonymous. Change my name. But anyways, Courtney's getting bored. I don't want her to have to get up and do anything else again. So, any other thoughts?
That'll be it.
All right.